Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I'm just giving a rough guide on how I evaluate new champions. As always, my notes are in the description if you'd prefer to read them for yourselves, and there is just video gameplay in the background so you have something to look at while I talk. That said, the first thing I do is a damage baseline check, and this is literally what it sounds like. Is the damage just good enough to use? I'm not really concerned about is it amazing or is it like maybe a little subpar. It can be subpar, that's fine. There's just like a minimum quantity of damage a champion needs to output in order to be viable. A really good example of this is Tarax. It just doesn't matter how good Tarax's utility could have potentially been. His damage is so bad, he's just a meme. Or Ebony Maw, same concept. Like, when you're looking at like 300 hits on a fight, it just doesn't matter if it's a super easy fight because you're just going to use someone else. And there are instances where utility might overcome those, but because there are other options as well, it doesn't matter. So that's just the baseline check. The next thing is regarding damage is the damage absurd to the point that it becomes a selling metric? Another really good example of this, or a good example of this, is Cosmic Ghost Rider, who has really good utility options, but his damage is just so insane that he's commonly seen just getting these meme-worthy special 2s off and video content. And it's worth selling. It's worth talking about. Where Aegon, when ramped up, like, damage is worth selling as a metric. And that is worth noting, but if you're going to look at absurd damage, and especially when higher damage numbers hit the board, because a lot of new champions, when they become worth talking about or want to meet like higher on tier lists, it's important to evaluate the practicality of that damage. So going from high damage and seeing, okay, this champion has a high damage rate, the first thing I think about is it a quest long ramp up or is it a ramp up in general? So quest long ramp up, you're looking at like Aegon or now Strife, where you have to ramp that champion up to damage over time, and you want to evaluate the practicality of that. So at first, Aegon isn't like the greatest in earlier content, but when you're looking at Labyrinth of Legends or Abyss of Legends, he just cannot be replaced. Call Obsidian, before his rework, the ramp up was just too long because it was 3 to 4 fights, and then by the time you already did that, you had taken a lot of block damage, and just the practicality in the ramp up wasn't there. You've also got Airwalker, where you need to ramp him up on 2 fights prior, and it just really isn't worth it, and that, you know, once he gets to that stage, it's just not good enough. So there's a bit of a question and a line between how much effort you need to put in to ramp them up and what the payoff is. Then you also have like fight style ramp up champions like Silver Surfer, so I evaluated on that as well. How much work are you putting in each fight to ramp them up? Because there are a lot of champions who already get heavy quantities of damage without having to ramp up. But there are some champions who have a fight-by-fight ramp-up that is super worth it. Look at Doom or a Max Sig Namor. After looking at like the practicality of ramp-up, the next thing I want to look at is synergy reliance. Now, some champions with synergies are amazing. They're absolutely insane, and it's definitely worth acknowledging. But it's also important to note that for every synergy you add to a champion, it removes value from Alliance Quest, it removes value from Alliance War, probably the 2 most frequently played game modes, and then from there it removes value from Abyss of Legends and endgame content as you go forward. Now, endgame content can be a little bit finicky here or there because sometimes you really are just power boosting one champion to push your way through, but at the very least for Abyss of Legends, you don't have space for 2 to 3 synergies. Every space on your team becomes valuable. And maybe for path 1, you have an extra slot or 2 you can work your way around, depending on what kind of utility you're getting. But when you're looking at all 5 paths, it's just not practical. And because of that, it's worth noting that like insane ramp up damage or insane potential utility with multiple synergies isn't always as insane as it seems to be. So that's pretty important. The next thing is this champion node reliant? And then kind of like a question of like how niche or common is that node? Some champions respond to nodes. A good example of this is like anti-degeneration. Now, yes, there are other portions of the game where degeneration is relevant, but for the most part, anti-degeneration is a response to nodes. So then it's a question of how common is that node and how relevant that kind of an ability is, and would it be better to just deal with it with, say, ability accuracy reduction or phasing mechanic or healing with like ghost and or clairvoyant, etc., etc. So that node reliance on, you know, whether or not a champion is good just purely on the node is incredibly worth noting, because some champions are good for a node that is just permanently there. One really good example is dish track. We just know dish track and buffed up are permanent part of the Cavalier event. That might change down the line, but at least at the moment they are staples in the quest. So if a new champion comes out and they are amazing for dish track, right, then, you know, we know that champion at least has a cemented month-by-month value, even if it's just to make your life a little bit easier. The next question I look at is skill reliance, still going down the damage rotation question or the usability of a champion. So if a champion is skill reliant, it does get marks in my book. Now for me personally, I don't mind. I will learn the champion if they are worth learning, but not everybody has, you know, the Midas touch. Not everybody has super quick reflexes or the time to commit to learning a new champion if that champion is incredibly challenging to learn or incredibly punishing. Also, for things like Alliance Quest or Alliance War, where you're doing fight after fight after fight, if a champion is very skill reliant and you're not able to commit that time to really get consistent with them, that champion doesn't even enter your roster because you're not able to get reliable value from them. And that's important. Now, again, there's going to be pools of players where skill reliance doesn't matter because they will put the effort in. It's just that from a broad spectrum and a value pool of champions, skill level or the difficulty of a champion needs to be evaluated, because the easier it is to learn a champion and play them for the same amount of payoff is always better. Next up is burst versus persistent damage. So when I'm looking at a champion, and especially looking at their damage, I want to know if it's burst or persistent damage. And this is incredibly important because some champions have an insane amount of burst, like Namor. But because it comes in a very heavy dose burst rotation that often relies on really good timing and typically results in longer fights and well-timed play, he gets overshadowed by a lot of faster, much simpler rotation champions, and that will keep happening as other champions hit the same utility without the added complexities or length of time for ramp up, because you just don't need the same quantity of damage in burst. It's just better to get it in persistent form most of the time. But also you've got champions who maybe don't ramp up, and maybe their damage isn't necessarily persistent, but there's no ramp up. It's like Ghost, where you just land your SP2 and that's your big burst damage, but it's just an SP2. You can rotate that no problem very simply. And because of that, it's really important. You've also got champions like Nick Fury who are persistent damage. That is their centric value is from their persistent damage, and that is really good for a lot of things like champions who have anti-crit mechanics, or do you bleed, or special nodes where you want damage over time effects, especially since we know we're seeing more and more of those enter the game. A lot of protections, a lot of, you know, mitigating quantity of damage or hit caps, damage caps, like Abyss of Legends and Labyrinth of Legends. These are all things that affect, you know, big yellow numbers not being as relevant. Look at the Proxima Midnight Syndrome is probably the common one, where she hits insane numbers. Doesn't matter because the content where it does, it's capped anyways. So next up is Sig level. Some champions are very amazing and their abilities are top notch. They're really just cutting edge, but their Sig level requirement is so high that they go unused by the general populace. And that's important to note. Look at Namor, who has just like really great utility, but it requires a 206 stone investment, and for most people that's just not worth it. And again, you know, it depends on where you fall in the MCOC community, but it's important to evaluate new champions on that. Personally, I like to see Sig levels that give extra damage but don't add utility. I like it when Sig levels give value but don't define a champion. And if it's going to define a champion, I want it to be really good and at least be attached to high prestige, like Namor was. Next up is Mastery Reliance. Some amazing champions are very Mastery Reliant. Look at Omega Red, for example, or Nick Fury with Deep Wounds, or Sin Supreme with Mystic Dispersion. And so when I see a new champion come out, one of the questions I ask is, are they Mastery Reliant? Particularly with, you know, that bleed, the Deep Wounds, and the Mystic Dispersion. Those are the most common. because for some people, they don't want to change their masteries very often, myself included, and that just naturally takes a little bit of value off of a champion. Now, what I want from that as a result is not for them to not make champions that aren't mastery reliant, because that's just inherently difficult. What I want is for the value from the mastery reliance to be worth taking the time to either invest the units and the resources into that mastery, or to change my masteries up, or be non-impacting enough to the point where I wouldn't call it a reliance so much as just like an added benefit. Look at Magneto Red, where he can heal off of 1 point coagulate and willpower off of the bleed, but it's like not a big deal if you don't have it. Next up is time. Now, maybe the damage is really good. Maybe it is, but maybe it's also very time consuming. A good example is a lot of special threes, or maybe really, really long rotations. Like you got to do a lot of heavy charging. And sometimes it's just not worth it. Sometimes it's better to just have a faster gameplay champion. It's a minor aspect. I think time is something I'm more willing to give up for more power or utility from a champion, but it's definitely worth noting because there's a lot of champions who could potentially get there. It just takes so long. A really good example of this is Iron Man Infinity War, who has a lot of utility and really good ramp up damage. It just takes so long to get there. I never see myself playing him. Next up, as a full broad category, kind of stepping away from damage, is I want to talk about evaluating survivability. Now, when I talk about survivability, one of the first things is block proficiency, because we've seen how poor block proficiency can absolutely just neuter a champion's value. Look at Call Obsidian. After that, I look at regeneration, because regeneration, while it is a utility, is its own selling point in itself, especially if it's accessible. Look at like Guillotine 2099, or people who love Angela. She's really fun. She has a lot of really good, innate healing. I might be using that wrong, but she has a lot of natural, persistent healing. And that regeneration adds a lot of survivability to champion, means that they don't have to have the world's greatest block proficiency in order to persistently survive throughout the whole quest. And especially when we see longer chain quests, it becomes more and more important. Next up is sustain. Does the champion have an alternative method of sustain? So I know this is pretty similar to survivability, but what I'm talking about here is champions like Quake or Ghost or Corvus or Captain Marvel movie champions who have another way of mitigating damage, either by not taking hits, blocked hits, or having an invulnerability effect. These can add just a lot of really, really good utility to a champion and a lot of good survivability that makes them much better for things like Alliance Quest and Alliance War, because being able to use them on a 5-day out of 8 rotation period over and over and over again and save items is very, very, very valuable. And honestly, we could use with a couple more in the game just to help, deepen the pool. Next up is separating the category, kind of stepping back from survivability, and is evaluating utility. Now, I just have a couple utility examples. The first one is immunities, of course. Essentially, immunities is just raw value, right? Like, some classes more than other need immunities. I think a really good example of this is like Mutant and Cosmic. Whenever I look at Mutant and Cosmic, the first thing I want to think about is like, do they have Incinerate immunity, or does Cosmic have Poison immunity? Because a lot of time Cosmic classes are the buff classes, and I want them to have a Fury buff, and I want them to have a Poison immunity, because I want them to be able to do Caustic Temper. They're just one of the most common answers for that when you look at like Hyperion or Captain Marvel movie, etc. But also when you look at like mutants, they're often the answer for Incinerate immunity or Bleed immunity, sometimes Poison immunity, and Tech is a really good example of, because of the prevalence of robots, having Bleed and Poison immunity. So that's really, really important. It's a very, very core aspect of the game. And so when I see a champion that's like, say, a mutant and they don't have any immunities, I immediately kind of raise an eyebrow a little bit, because it already takes them off of part of a very important aspect of the game that I know I can no longer use that champion for. Next up is power control. We see a lot of power control champions enter the game, but if these days power control needs to be compared to the likes of Doom and Magic. It's okay to have other power control mechanics that are similar or potentially near as good, but if it's not as good as Doom or Magic, it immediately gets a hit, like a mental hit of like, why wouldn't you just use one of those two? Why wouldn't you just use Dakok, who has passive power locking? You know, when you have a lot of really, really powerful power control champions in the game, when a new one comes in, they have to keep up. Because if they don't, they just immediately get shelved. It's just a reality. Next up is slow/unstoppable removal. Just because a champion has the ability slow in their kit does not mean they have access to slow. Because what's important here is accessibility, the ease of triggering the slow, or also uptime, the duration or the period of time that the slow is up and active. So a really good example for this is Stealth Suit Spider-Man's slow effect. He inflicts the web cartridge. You would typically want to put it on Mixmaster because they evade. Or tunnel vision to prevent missing. And I know this isn't slow, but it's a similar effect. He has the ability to prevent miss. It's pretty much useless because you can't get it off of a parry 4 hit. You aren't actually able to get the double light rotation in you need in order to place it. So you're reliant on placing it with an SP2. Meaning you got to build all the way up to an SP2 before you actually get it off. Why wouldn't you just use Torch, who is anti-miss much sooner, or Nick Fury, who can get it off of SP1s. The reality is you just would use someone else. Another good example here is uptime is like Red Guardian. Red Guardian places a very solid, I want to say it's like 12 seconds, it might be 9 seconds slow, but he places a very solid duration slow debuff. And then you can refresh it with heavy, which means 1 SP1 and you have a perma slow on the opponent. Very, very good. That is amazing utility. Sorcerer Supreme, who places it on every special as long as you're in the right phase, I believe. I'm not a Sorcerer Supreme player. I apologize for lack of knowledge there. But my point here is what you want when you're looking at this kind of an ability is virtual 100% uptime. Once you get it up, you want it up 100% of the time, because a lot of the time when slow is the issue you're looking at like the 6.2.6 champion boss, where the slow is triggering very, very often. So any kind of downtime on the anti-slow means you're going to be looking at an unstoppable champion punching you into your block and you're just getting chipped away. Next up is ability accuracy reduction. Now this is very complicated and it's honestly its own video in its own right, but generally speaking, when I look at ability accuracy reduction, if we ain't talking 100, don't talk to me. Next up is buff prevention. When we're looking at buff prevention, to me, the most important thing here is accessibility. Nullification on an SP2 is not accessible. If you need to nullify something incredibly important, say like a power gain buff, and you have to get all the way up to an SP2 to do it, good luck. And if you, heaven forbid, you need to do that on a repeat occurrence, it's just not super common. Additionally, nullifies or staggers placed on heavies, while good and usable, they get an immediate mental hit, because if you can't stun the opponent, which is very often the case, how are you going to get that stagger on? And again, if it's a stagger and not a nullify, there are a lot of champions who just start with the buff, and it's a permanent buff. How are you going to remove it in some way, shape, or form? You're just going to deal with it until you can get to a special 2. It's very important. Next up is heal reversal. The only thing I want to say is when I look at a heal reversal champion is it reliant on Petrify? Because Deadpool, Red, and Abyss can't be heal reversed with Petrify. So it's important to talk about. Next up is niche lockdown / targeted counters. Now, I love targeted counter champions. I like that the immediate place they have, they're just super tough to balance because they might suffer from like the torch effect or the red Magneto effect, where they come in and they're absolutely bonkers. Absolutely insane, and they either become a champion who is a staple in the meta, or they become like Blade, where they fall off as a result of Kabam saying, okay, we screwed up, we're going to stop putting villains in the game, and now Blade doesn't answer later game content because we don't put villains in the game anymore. Kind of tricky. I don't want to see that happen to Red Mags. I don't want to see it happen to Torch, but it is totally a possibility. It's called obsolescence. So while I love targeted counters in the short run, in the long run, there's a lot of potential. And seeing that and acknowledging it and saying, yes, this champion has value, but acknowledging that later on they might lose that value over time is important when evaluating a new champion. And then second to last is Alliance War Defense. You know me, I love a good defender. Does the champion have really good, annoying specials to dodge, unblockable or unstoppable triggers? Do they have high survivability? All these things are super important because sometimes you just want a really good defender to soft the other player. And then finally, and probably the least important here, is superficiality. ways. So aesthetic, lore, character, popularity, animations, all of these are incredibly important. I don't typically, review champions based on that, but I will not be ashamed to admit that I have ranked up champions for aesthetic. My clairvoyant is ranked up because I like clairvoyant. I'm not afraid to admit it. I've got a rank 5 Black Widow Deadly Origins because come on, it's Scarlett Johansson, okay? Rank her up. That said, as always, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.